Before meeting Janet, I led a relatively independent and satisfying life. My late 20s were a time of career progress and increasing stability. I had always imagined settling down with the right person, but I wasn't in a hurry. After several relationships, I started to understand that real companionship wasn't just about compatibility, but about building a purposeful life together. During one of those reflective periods, Janet came into my life. Meeting her changed my priorities almost immediately. She had a magnetic presence that made me feel like we could achieve anything together. Before long, we were planning for the future, marriage, and hopefully starting a family. We both envisioned a life based on stability, mutual understanding, and a commitment to support each other through all challenges. Janet and I got married later than most, with me being 28 and her 31. That was 6 years ago. Before we met, we had each fully enjoyed our youthful freedom, but that left us without much financial security when we finally started our life together. Before the wedding, we discussed our desire to have kids and our plan for Janet to stay home with them until the youngest reached school age. We both felt strongly that having a stay-at-home parent was important for a child's development, provided we could afford it. This gave us time to save money before expanding our family. Janet worked full-time while I took every overtime shift I could, often doubling up on Fridays and working long hours on Saturdays. Our hard work was paying off. We now owned our home outright, and our savings were growing. Recent conversations suggested that kids were likely soon, hopefully before Janet turned 40, as the chances of having our first child would decrease after that. That's why the conversation we had this Thursday night felt so unreal. "Kurt, I want to talk about a trial separation," she said. My mind went blank. "What?" I blurted out in disbelief. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a breakup, you know the feeling. The other person seems to have it all figured out while you're left blindsided and unprepared. That was me at that moment. "Why?" I managed to ask, still trying to process what she was saying. "I just think we need some time apart to rediscover ourselves and appreciate each other again," she explained. "Let's be honest, Kurt. You're not as romantic as you used to be, and you seem to take me for granted. You always say you're too tired to go out. Our closeness has declined, and to be honest, you've gained some weight. Don't you think a break could help us?" I was speechless, struggling to absorb her words and the suddenness of it all. Had I been more composed, I might have noticed the subtle shift from us to me in her words, but at that moment, it completely escaped me. "How about we take a month, Kurt?" she suggested. "Then we can reassess. I'll stay at Wendy's. You can call me whenever, but let's limit our in-person meetings to once a week. Any more than that, and it won't feel like a real separation, will it? Just know, Kurt, that I love you deeply and believe we'll have beautiful children together. I'm confident that after a month, maybe 2 at most, we'll be back to where we were." With that, Janet stood, grabbed 2 suitcases from the hallway, and headed for the door. "Don't I get a say in this, Janet?" I stammered. "My decision is made, Kurt," she said firmly. "Please sit down, Janet," I pleaded. Reluctantly, she sat down again. "Who is he, Janet?" I couldn't help but ask. "Oh, Kurt, I knew you'd jump to that conclusion," she sighed. "I love you, Kurt, and only you. There's no one else, so there's no need to check my phone, follow me, put a GPS tracker in my car, or hire a private investigator. In fact, if you did any of those things, I'd see it as a lack of trust, and we'd have to reconsider our relationship." As she moved to stand up again, I instinctively grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "This isn't fair, Janet. You've had days, maybe weeks, to plan this out and make your speech." "But it's all new to me," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "What move, Kurt?" she asked, finally reflecting some of the confusion I was feeling. "Don't you see that what you've done risks our relationship? Janet, this one-sided decision feels disrespectful. I've always treated you as my equal, and I'd never make such a risky move without discussing it with you first." "What risk, Kurt? I love you and you love me. Where's the damage in a short break? If I miss you before the month is up, I'll come back in an instant." "And what do you mean by contempt?" she asked, her tone now curious and concerned. "I mean, you haven't given me a chance to explain myself," I replied. "For example, we don't go out much because I've been working overtime on Fridays and Saturdays. We agreed to those extra hours to improve our finances. Our closeness has faded, partly because of the natural evolution of a 6-year marriage, and partly because I'm always exhausted. As for my weight, it's because you suggested I take on the supervisor role for extra pay, which isn't as physically demanding. Those are just my initial thoughts in the last 2 minutes. Can't you stay so we can talk this through properly?" "I'm sorry, Kurt. I promised Wendy I'd go out with her tonight. she said softly but firmly. With that, she stood, picked up her bags, and walked toward the door. All I could say was, "Just remember, Janet, you're still married." She paused briefly, but then continued out the door without looking back. That night, I couldn't fall asleep, leaving me exhausted and unprepared for the grueling 16-hour shift the next day. Despite my fatigue, I couldn't change plans. The afternoon shift supervisor had already made arrangements, counting on my promise to cover for him again. In my line of work, letting your guard down was never an option. So there I was on Friday night, in the wrong place at the wrong time, nearly being run over by a 35-ton loader. I barely managed to jump out of the way at the last second, feeling the heat of the exhaust as I touched the ground. Adrenaline kept me going through the rest of the shift, heightened by hunger. Since Thursday, Janet's usual grocery run had been skipped because she was busy packing. The next day, I was back at work by 10 a.m., surviving on sandwiches made from stale bread. The following night, I stopped by a 24-hour corner store to pick up supplies. When I got home after 11:30 p.m., I saw the message light blinking on the phone. It was Janet, telling me she missed me and thanking me for giving her space by not calling. She mentioned she'd be out late again that night and asked me not to call, which left me feeling more resentful. Here I was, working myself to the bone to contribute 3 times as much to our savings, while she seemed to be enjoying herself without a care. It was a bitter feeling, one I hadn't experienced before. Neither of us reached out on Sunday. By Monday, I decided to tell my boss I wouldn't be available for overtime for the time being. When he asked why, I told him about the near accident on Friday night, and he looked surprised and quickly agreed with my decision. By Wednesday, with no contact from Janet, she finally called. It didn't seem like she had much to say. Feeling a bit guilty for ignoring her, I decided to make things right. On Thursday evening after dinner, I headed to Wendy's house with a bouquet of flowers and a box of chocolates as a peace offering. Wendy, Janet's best friend who had been divorced for over a year, welcomed me in. I never knew the real reason for her divorce, but I had my suspicions. She said Janet was in the shower and invited me to wait on the couch. As I sat, Wendy moved closer to me, making me uncomfortable. I shifted away subtly, but she persisted. Thankfully, Janet appeared just then. I gave her the flowers and chocolates, but our conversation was awkward and lacked the ease we usually shared. After some small talk, Janet asked, "Was there something you wanted, Kurt?" Her question caught me off guard. "No, I just came by to ask my wife out on a date tomorrow night," I said. "I'm sorry, Wendy and I already have plans," Janet replied. "Wait, tomorrow is Friday. You usually work on Friday nights," I pointed out. "Not anymore. I quit," I admitted. "But what about the money?" she asked, clearly concerned. "I've decided to prioritize my marriage and my health," I said, looking her in the eye. "With the extra responsibilities of cooking, cleaning, and working full-time, I've been more exhausted than ever. When you left me that message last Saturday night about going out, I realized I was pushing myself too hard. Last Friday, I was so tired that I almost had a serious accident at work." Janet's expression shifted to shock, and she hugged me. "Please be careful," she whispered. "I'll need you in a few months." The moment was interrupted when Wendy returned to the room, ending the conversation abruptly. "Sorry to rush you, Kurt, but we have a Tupperware party starting soon," Wendy announced. Taking the hint, I left quickly. Some things a man just shouldn't stick around for. Janet walked me to the door, and in desperation, I asked, "Please come home, Janet. I miss you." "Give it 3 more weeks, Kurt. We'll talk then," she said, visibly uncomfortable. Any hope I felt vanished when she added, "Take a break from overtime for a month and rest up. We'll need the extra money, Kurt." I glanced at the flowers and chocolates she'd tossed aside and left without another word. Over the next week, Janet called twice, disappointed that I hadn't reached out. I tried to explain that between working full-time, cooking, and going to the gym, I had little time left, but she didn't seem to get it. The next week, I stopped by on Tuesday night. Again, Janet was in the shower when I arrived. This time, I avoided the couch, recalling the discomfort from my last visit. Wendy, dressed to the nines, stood too close for comfort, making me uneasy. When Janet finally came downstairs, also dressed up, she seemed a bit uncomfortable as she explained, "I should have called first. Had I done so, I would have known they were going out." Feeling embarrassed, I was quickly ushered out, and as the door closed behind me, I thought I heard giggles. I vowed that would be the last time I let myself feel humiliated. Neither of us reached out for the rest of the week. The following Sunday, I was in the backyard lifting weights I had made myself. I could feel my strength returning. Suddenly, I felt arms wrap around me from behind and someone press against my back. It was the first human contact I'd had in over 2 weeks, and I welcomed it, until I heard Wendy's voice whisper in my ear. "Sorry, handsome. I couldn't resist," she murmured. Shocked, I quickly pulled away and turned around, trying to hide my discomfort. I offered her coffee and couldn't help but notice her outfit, which, though typical for her, showcased an ample amount of cleavage. I made sure to sit at the far end of the kitchen table to create some distance, but Wendy dragged her chair right beside mine, so close our legs were touching. We engaged in awkward small talk, a skill I had never mastered. "Are you going to ask how Janet's doing?" Wendy inquired. "No," I responded firmly. "She made it clear that's none of my business." Wendy's smile widened. "She's a little upset, you know. She thought you'd be begging and groveling by now." "Sorry, Wendy, that's not my style," I replied. "I asked her out on a date when I first came here, and she turned me down, saying she already had plans. She never bothered to reschedule. I don't know what this separation is about, so I'm just going to wait and see if she comes back or if our marriage is done." I knew everything I said would get back to Janet. Wendy's reaction was predictable. Instead of showing concern, she smiled and placed her hand on my leg. I felt like this was a test, one I was determined to pass since I had no emotional attraction to Wendy. Physically, though, she was tempting, especially since another button on her blouse had somehow come undone. "You know, I've always admired you and Janet as a couple," Wendy continued, her tone probing. "You must be really secure in your love to let her date other guys. Or are you just pretending not to care?" My blood ran cold. We hadn't discussed dating during this separation, but my reminder, "Don't forget you're married," should have made my stance clear. Without a word, I abruptly left the house and headed to the backyard. Through the kitchen window, I saw Janet lounging on the deck in a bikini, sunbathing. With determination, I marched outside. "What's this about you dating, Janet?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "I haven't been dating, Kurt," she answered nonchalantly. "We met a couple of guys last Tuesday at a club, danced with them, and mentioned we might be there again. We bumped into them last night, but it wasn't a date." "And what happened last night?" I pressed. "Nothing inappropriate, just dancing," she said. "They bought us drinks, but we didn't kiss or do anything like that. We just danced." "Since when is it appropriate for a married woman to dance with other men while her husband's not there?" I asked. She was silent. "If you see them again, it'll definitely be a date, and it's definitely inappropriate. Janet, all of this is hurting me. I still don't know what this separation is about. Can we skip the next 2 weeks and just have you come home? I really miss you." "No, Kurt, not yet," she replied firmly. "In fact, I think we'll go longer than a month. I haven't gotten my old feelings for you back yet." She seemed oddly uncomfortable, like she didn't truly want to say that. Of all her recent behavior, this was the most confusing. I stared at her for a moment before getting up to leave. "You could ask me on another date, you know," she remarked casually. "You might get lucky this time." Without pausing or turning back, I replied, "Or you could ask me out. You know where I live." Starting Monday, Janet called the home phone every night. Our conversations were brief and uncomfortable, and I had the feeling she was just checking to see if I was home. The implication didn't sit well with me. On Friday night, the call forwarding to my mobile worked perfectly. I answered, hearing music in the background. I was already on my way to Wendy's house and saw Janet's car was missing from the driveway. I drove by the nightclub strip nearby and eventually spotted her car parked outside one of the bars. I peered through the window and saw Janet and Wendy sitting alone in a booth. Shortly after, 2 more women joined them. One was Barbara, a friend of Janet's, and the other was unfamiliar. Seeing my chance, I slipped into the bar unnoticed and took a seat in the corner, far from their view. A few minutes later, luck was on my side as the booth next to theirs emptied. I quickly sat down, staying out of sight by keeping my back to them. With some effort, I managed to catch most of the conversation, with Barbara leading it. "Conversation? You're crazy, Janet," Barbara said incredulously. "From what you've said, your Kurt sounds way more romantic than my husband," said a voice I didn't recognize, likely belonging to the stranger. "Yeah, I agree," the stranger continued. "I would have been happy to get half of what you described from my ex." Wendy chimed in. "Don't you think Janet deserves better? Just look at her. She's gorgeous." Barbara added, "I don't know. This sounds like a dangerous game to me. How do you treat him, Janet? Do you spoil him rotten? He must be exhausted from all that overtime. Do you keep him in bed all Sunday, giving him everything he wants? If you were mine, I would," Janet replied softly, but I couldn't make out her words. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, and the next thing I heard was Barbara's voice again. "Is that all? And you're still making this guy fight for you? At that moment, someone started the jukebox, giving me the perfect opportunity to slip away to the restroom. When I came back, my booth was taken, so I returned to my corner in the bar. As the crowd grew, I wondered how long it would be until the guys showed up. Over the next hour, I watched several men approach the girls, attempting to make conversation, but all of them left disappointed. Then I noticed the unfamiliar woman walking toward the bar. As she passed my corner, I made a show of moving aside for her. She smiled and ordered 4 drinks. While waiting, she turned to me and asked, "So, do you come here often?" with a playful grin. "Hey, that's my line," I joked. "Well, you were too slow," she shot back. We struck up a light conversation until her drinks were ready. I noticed her glancing at my wedding ring finger. "The conversation at my table is awful. Do you mind if I use you as an excuse to escape?" she asked, flashing a mischievous smile. "Do I mind if a beautiful woman talks to me? What do you think? But I should warn you, I'm married, though my marriage is in serious trouble," I admitted. "Wow, well, thanks for being honest. I'm just looking for some company, so if that's okay, I'd still like to chat," she responded, her smile softening. Alice returned a couple of minutes later, and we continued talking easily for the next hour and a half. I kept glancing over to ensure no one noticed us. I saw a man had taken the empty seat at the girls' table, buying all the drinks. Alice was great company, and we quickly felt comfortable with each other. Around 11:30, Barbara approached us. "You're right, he is cute," Barbara whispered to Alice with a smile. "Alice, do you want a ride? Janet's offered to drive us home," Barbara asked. "I've got to get going anyway. It was lovely talking to you, Alice," I said, kissing her on the cheek. She blushed as she handed me a business card with a smile before leaving. 2 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Janet calling through the forwarded home phone line. "Are you having a party at the house?" she asked suspiciously. "No, I'm at a bar. I've been chatting with a beautiful girl all evening," I replied, not backing down. "What the hell, Kurt? Who said you could do that?" she exclaimed. "Are you implying that you're the only one who can date? Or are you saying I can't?" I shot back. "You can't while you're married to me. I expect you to behave appropriately," she said sharply. "So, you're saying you didn't call me from a bar earlier?" I challenged. "Well, yes," she admitted reluctantly. "And I suppose those guys from last time didn't show up either, right?" I pressed. "No, yes, maybe," she stammered. "Look, Kurt, I told you I'm not dating," she replied, her tone uncertain. "Janet, can we just stop this nonsense and go back to how things were? Come home now. I'll meet you there," I pleaded, softening my voice. There was a pause before she replied. "No, Kurt, I'm just not ready." "Okay, then just come for the night," I tried again. "No, sorry, Kurt, I'll call you later," she said before hanging up. The hours dragged on, and just as I was falling asleep, I heard the garage door open. My heart raced, thinking Janet had come home. I looked out the window and saw her car parked across the street. As the garage door closed, I realized she had only come by to check if I was home before driving off again. Disheartened, I returned to bed, my mind swirling with confusion. The next Saturday afternoon, Wendy dropped by. I confronted her about Janet's behavior, but she denied knowing anything, though unconvincingly. "What are you doing, Wendy? I'm married to your best friend," I said, holding her at arm's length as she tried to get close to me. "For now, Kurt," Wendy replied with feigned innocence. "I just wanted to see if I'd have a chance with you after Janet leaves." Her words sounded ridiculous, but they confirmed my suspicions. "Don't you mean if Janet leaves me?" I corrected. "Of course, Kurt, I really hope things work out for you," she said vaguely, sensing my unease. I walked her to the door, though she seemed reluctant to leave, even offering to prepare a picnic for us. In the end, I had to firmly explain how inappropriate her behavior was before she finally got the hint. "Are you and Janet going out tonight?" she asked before leaving. "Yes, probably," I replied, feeling frustrated. Later, I decided to call Alice. She was happy to hear from me, but said she couldn't meet that night. "How about Tuesday instead?" she suggested. "Just as friends, Alice. I'm still going through a messy situation, but I really enjoyed your company the other night," I reminded her, not wanting to lead her on. "I understand, Kurt. I enjoyed our chat too. Let's meet Tuesday," she said warmly. Monday marked the beginning of a new routine with Janet. She started calling me at 6 a.m. every day, again at 6 p.m. when I got home from work, and once more before bed. Though she claimed it was because she missed me, she kept refusing to come home. It was becoming clear she was just checking up on me. On Wednesday, I noticed a message on the home phone answering machine. Though it was just from a marketing company, Its significance struck me. It hadn't been diverted to my mobile. When I checked the home phone, I discovered the call forwarding had been disabled. It seemed someone had been by the house. When Tuesday arrived, I met Alice at her apartment and we headed out to a restaurant. She looked stunning as usual. Once we were seated, I decided to ask her a more personal question. "So would you like to tell me why your personal life is a bit complicated?" I asked, curious. Alice smiled but hesitated before answering. "Sure, her name is Diana," she revealed. Diana turned out to be Alice's 3-year-old daughter. The father had left them after deciding that family life wasn't for him. Tonight, Alice's mother was watching Diana. To steer the conversation away from my own problems, I turned the focus back to her experience at the bar last week. "You mentioned the conversation at your table was pretty awful. What was that all about?" I asked. Alice sighed. "Oh, that. It was just terrible conversation and shallow people. There was this woman named Janet. She's currently separated from her husband, but she's hoping that the separation will make him fight for her, be more romantic and all that. The crazy thing is, from what she described, he already seems like a great guy," Alice explained. I frowned. "Great? How?" "He brings her flowers every week, takes her on date nights every month, spoils her. Even though he works late on Saturdays, he still gets up early on Sundays to make her breakfast. He even surprised her with a cruise last year. Honestly, I would have been thrilled with half of that for my ex," Alice said, shaking her head. "Some people just don't appreciate what they have." "It gets even crazier," she continued. "Before they even separated, she was trying to make him jealous." "How?" I asked, intrigued. "She would come home later and later from girls' nights out wearing men's cologne on purpose. One time she even got a pair of underwear from her friend Wendy, used ones if you can believe it. She left them on the bedroom floor, hoping he'd notice, but he didn't say a word," Alice recounted, both amused and baffled. "Her husband sounds pretty clueless," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "Or maybe he loved her so much that he ignored those signs," Alice suggested. "But when all her tricks failed, she and her friend came up with this trial separation idea, hoping it would make him desperate. Instead, he's not reacting at all." "Good for him," I said. "Yeah, but when he didn't play along, they tried escalating. She stopped reaching out to him, and when he ignored her, her friend planted the idea that she was dating other guys. Still, he didn't bite. Honestly, I admire him. It's exactly what I'd do if someone treated me like that," Alice said sympathetically. "The heartbreaking part is when Barbara asked Janet how much effort she put into the marriage. That's when Janet seemed to realize how one-sided their relationship had been. You'd think that would be the wake-up call she needed to stop all this, but no. They've backed themselves into a corner because this proud guy refuses to follow their script," Alice added. "She could just go back to him, lay everything out, and try to fix it," I suggested. "Yeah, that's probably what she really wants. But I think her friend is the one keeping her on this path. Wendy gave her some strange, almost carnivory looks last Friday," Alice said, her tone thoughtful. "Do you think her friend is trying to drive a wedge between them to go after the husband herself?" I asked. "You might be onto something. It would fit with what I've seen, but if that's true, it makes her a cold, manipulative person," Alice said, narrowing her eyes. As our meals arrived, the conversation turned to lighter topics, but I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. When the waitress cleared our plates, I felt I had to address it. "You know, Alice, everything you've said has convinced me that you're a genuinely good person with strong values," I began. "Thank you," she replied with a smile. "Do you think I'm a decent person?" I asked, bracing myself. "Yes, I do. I think I'm a good judge of character, and I have no doubt you're a kind person," Alice answered without hesitation. Taking a deep breath, I realized what I had to do. "I need to tell you something," I said, gently holding her hands. "Please forgive me, Alice, but I haven't been entirely truthful with you. I've been struggling with a lot of confusion lately, and I've done things I'm not proud of in an effort to sort it out. But I respect you, and that's why I need to be honest and tell you everything." Alice looked at me with concern, waiting for me to continue. "My name is Kurt, and I've been married to a woman named Janet for 6 years. About 4 weeks ago, she insisted on a trial separation despite my objections. Tonight, a new friend suggested I should move on from her given the disrespect and pain she's caused me. And I've been leaning that way myself. You were right. I did treat her like a queen. But looking back, I see how little she gave in return." Alice's expression shifted as a range of emotions flickered across her face before settling on horror. She covered her mouth with a clenched fist. "Oh my God, did I just call your wife a stupid witch?" she gasped. "Actually, I was quite offended that you spoke about my wife that way," I replied, trying to keep a straight face. Her expression softened a bit, though the conflict in her eyes lingered. "Do you realize your first concern was whether you offended me? That speaks volumes about your character." "Of course, I forgive you," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Alice looked relieved but still tense. "So is that why you approached me on Friday night? Were you trying to gather information?" I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "You're right. That question caught me off guard. But can I count on your friendship until this situation gets resolved one way or another?" "Absolutely, Kurt. But I want to be clear. I don't want to have any part in sabotaging your marriage," she said firmly. "Thank you. Your friendship is all I need right now. From my perspective, I thought our marriage was perfectly fine until one Thursday when Janet dropped the trial separation bombshell. She originally planned to leave without explaining anything, but I insisted on some clarity. Even with her explanation, I'm still confused. I didn't have many close friendships because I was so focused on either work or my relationship with Janet." Alice listened carefully before asking, "Do you think there's a chance for reconciliation?" "I'm not sure, Alice. Part of me feels like taking her back after the way she's treated me would be a letdown to myself. And after our conversation, I've realized just how one-sided our marriage has been, especially when it comes to romance. Honestly, it's a bit embarrassing to admit," I confessed. By mutual agreement, we shifted to lighter topics for the rest of the evening and ended up having a good time. Eventually, Alice needed to head home to relieve her mother, who was babysitting Diana. "I had a great time tonight," Alice said with a smile as we stood outside her apartment. "So did I replied, kissing her on the cheek before saying goodbye. The next day, as I walked toward the grocery store, I heard someone call out from a nearby coffee shop. I turned around to see Janet, Wendy, and another woman sitting at a table. My heart sank when I recognized Barbara. She couldn't hide her surprise upon seeing me. "You!" Barbara exclaimed, her eyes widening. The implications hit me quickly. Janet would soon realize I had been spying on her and that there were no men involved in her Friday night outings. Depending on what Barbara said, Janet might even figure out that Alice had shared details with me. Surprisingly, I wasn't as concerned as I expected to be. I made a polite excuse to leave, saying I needed to get home to cook. I watched Janet's face for any signs of guilt, but she didn't seem to notice anything. Later that night, around 9:30 p.m., the phone rang, just as I was about to fall asleep. Janet's voice came through sharply on the other end. "Kurt, didn't I tell you not to spy on me? This shows a lack of trust and respect," she scolded. "From my perspective, Janet, you started this separation without giving me a clear explanation. Wouldn't you try to understand the situation too?" I responded, frustration seeping into my tone. "It's still a violation of our agreement, Kurt." "Your agreement, Janet," I shot back, letting the silence hang in the air, hoping she'd understand the difference. But her response took an unexpected turn. "Kurt, I'm struggling to figure all of this out. This trial separation isn't playing out the way I thought it would. I'm not sure if my feelings for you are what they need to be. I think we should extend it by another month or two to see how things go." She paused, waiting for a reaction. I chose to stay silent. If she was hoping for an outburst, she wasn't going to get one. "Okay, Kurt. I didn't want to bring this up, but I think it's fair. I believe I should be allowed to date other men. Maybe it will help me appreciate you more and reignite my feelings for you," she continued, her voice soft but determined. This time, my silence wasn't deliberate. I was simply stunned. When I finally found my voice, I decided not to speak. Anything I said wouldn't resolve the situation. "Kurt, are you still there?" she pressed. "I think dating would be a serious mistake, Janet," I replied, my voice steady. "Let me be clear. If you date or engage in anything that crosses the boundaries of our marriage, meeting a man repeatedly, dancing, touching, or kissing another man, I will take it as your decision to leave our marriage. Am I clear?" There was silence on the other end before she responded, her voice sharp. "Well, Kurt, I don't think you're in a position to set terms. You don't own me. I think I'm entitled to the romance and companionship I've been missing over the past month." At that moment, I seriously questioned Janet's state of mind. Did she not realize the reason she was missing romance was because she had left the person who provided it? "So, Janet, you're still intent on opening up this marriage, are you?" I asked, struggling to comprehend her logic. "You've never given me a reason for this separation that made any sense. I thought you might be testing me to make me put more effort into our marriage, but I dismissed that idea as too disrespectful. The silence hung between us, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "I'm sorry, Kurt. My mind is made up." Her words were full of resignation. The dial tone ended the conversation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it also marked the end of our marriage. Strangely, when I got home on Thursday and Friday nights, I noticed Janet's car parked 100 meters down the street, facing away from my approach. 5 minutes later, I saw her drive off, adding yet another layer of confusion to an already bewildering situation. On Thursday night, Alice called. She graciously forgave me, lifting a weight off my shoulders. She then asked for an update, assuring me her inquiry was purely out of friendship. I recounted my recent conversations with Janet and my analysis of her likely motives. "So, what's your plan now, Kurt? Just going to sit back and wait for her to deal the final blow to your marriage? I guess. Do you want me to keep an eye on her this weekend, Kurt?" "No, don't get involved, Alice. How about we figure out where they are and you take me to the same place?" "No, I won't stoop to her level, but I would like to see you this weekend." We quickly arranged a picnic for Sunday afternoon. After a little back and forth, Alice didn't press me on why I wasn't free on Friday or Saturday. She understood. We must have talked for 2 hours that Friday, and it didn't take long to figure out where Janet and Wendy were. The fact that they were at the same bar made me think of two possibilities. Either Janet was confident I wouldn't dare spy on her again, or more likely, she expected me to do just that. This time, I watched everything unfold from the windows, feeling a bit ashamed of myself. Surprisingly, Janet behaved well that night. It was just her, Wendy, and Barbara chatting. Until around 10 p.m., Wendy accepted a few dance offers, but Janet and Barbara turned them down. Eventually, two persistent guys approached Janet and Wendy. Barbara left shortly after, leaving the trio at the table. Throughout the evening, Janet and Wendy frequently scanned the darker corners of the bar. I was pleasantly surprised when they both left together at 11:30. I followed their taxi home and stayed until the lights went out. Saturday was different. Again, they were at the same bar, and the same two guys were waiting. This time, they didn't waste time making a move. My marriage ended when Wendy went off to dance with one of them, leaving the other guy to pursue Janet. From my vantage point, I saw his hand on her leg. I gave her 5 minutes to handle the situation, during which she scanned the bar at least 6 times. I walked into the bar. When Janet saw me approaching, she at least had the decency to push the guy's hand away. Her expression, however, was smug as she opened with, "Kurt, I warned you not to spy on me again." Her unfortunate companion, sensing the tension, stood up, unsure whether to confront me or flee. Ignoring social norms, I stepped in close, towering over him with my 6-foot frame. In a low growl, I uttered the shortest sentence possible. "Go!" He bolted. Keeping my eyes on Janet's face, I sat in his vacated seat and pulled a roll of papers from my bosom pocket. "These are divorce papers, mutually agreed upon. I've already filled them out. All you need to do is sign. I've also included an agreement to split everything 50-50. I'll keep the house since you've already moved out." As I spoke, I watched her smug expression turn to one of horror. I didn't stay to see the rest of her reaction. Avoiding eye contact, I left quickly, hoping to hide the emotions building inside me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to watch through the window. Janet was crying openly. Wendy returned shortly after, looking puzzled. As soon as she saw the papers on the table, a grin spread across her face. Wendy did most of the talking over the next hour. 15 minutes in, Janet's tears had stopped, and by the end of their conversation, she looked remarkably at ease. Wendy's influence was clear. She had somehow convinced Janet that their plan was still on track. That night, sleep eluded me once again as I prepared for the inevitable final confrontation. More heartache was on the horizon, and despite everything, I couldn't shake my feelings for Janet. Expecting Wendy to show up the next day, I pretended not to be home when she arrived. Ignoring her calls, I waited in silence. Strangely, Janet didn't call. By 1:30 p.m., I found myself at Alice's door with a bunch of red roses. As soon as she saw the flowers, Alice wrapped me in a warm hug, offering comfort amidst the chaos. "I was going to ask how the past few days went, but I think I can tell," Alice remarked perceptively, glancing at the roses in my hand. She understood the gesture. It was clear that roses weren't something friends exchanged in the midst of unresolved issues. She led me inside, where I met her mother. "Kurt, this is my mom, Batty. Mom, meet my boyfriend, Kurt," Alice introduced us, her words catching me by surprise in the best way. I was momentarily speechless, wondering how much Alice had shared with her mom about us. Thankfully, Batty addressed the question hanging in the air. "So, is it over?" she asked. all but the shouting, as my dad used to say, I replied, updating them on the latest development. I explained that Janet hadn't fully grasped the seriousness of the situation yet, and that I still had to prove my resolve. Through my words, they could sense the pain I was in, and Batty offered a comforting hug. Just then, a little angel entered the room. Diana had woken from her nap. I was introduced to her as well. Diana seemed disappointed when Alice mentioned we were going out, despite Batty's efforts to cheer her up. Noticing Diana's reaction, I leaned toward Alice. "Can she come with us?" I whispered. "Are you sure?" she asked, surprised by my offer. "You're a package deal, and I accept that," I assured her. "That would be wonderful. It's hard to be away from her all week while I'm at work, so I try to spend my weekends with her," Alice explained, her eyes filled with gratitude. Diana's face lit up with joy when she heard she could join us for the afternoon. We had a wonderful time by the river, soaking in the sunshine and enjoying each other's company. Alice joked about feeling a bit left out, but the grin on her face made it clear she was only teasing. After dropping both of them home, I was greeted by Batty, who had prepared dinner. I said goodbye to Alice with a gentle kiss on the cheek before heading home. As I arrived home, I sensed Janet nearby, lurking in her usual spot. Before I could open the front door, she pulled into the driveway. Stepping out of her car, she handed me the divorce papers I had given her on Saturday. "Signed and witnessed." "Here you go, Kurt. Signed and witnessed." "Good night," she said, catching me off guard. Without another word, she walked back to her car. But as she was leaving, she called out boldly, "Now that I've called your bluff, maybe you can ask me out on a date this week. I'm free on Wednesday," before driving off. In that moment, I realized Janet was operating on a completely different wavelength. If the end was near, it seemed like it was going to be a chaotic one. And the chaos began on Monday evening. Wendy was waiting for me in the driveway when I got home from work. Before I could react, she kissed me. I pushed her away firmly and exclaimed, "Wendy, let me make this clear once and for all. I'm not the least bit interested in you." Before she could respond, Janet's car roared into the driveway, tires screeching. Wendy tried to run, but Janet blocked her escape. As soon as Janet stopped the car, she jumped out, flinging the door open and knocking Wendy to the ground. When Wendy tried to get up, Janet slapped her hard across the head, sending her back down. Wendy stayed down this time, knowing better than to challenge Janet's fury. But Janet, having realized she'd been deceived, unleashed her full rage, kicking Wendy repeatedly. I knew better than to interfere. Janet's anger was wild, like a cornered animal. When Janet showed signs of exhaustion but still seethed with anger, I risked stepping in to restrain her. At that moment, a police car happened to drive by. Both Janet and I were cuffed, and an ambulance was called for Wendy's injuries. Janet was interviewed first, and I could hear her shouts echoing from the holding cells. Eventually, they moved her to a cell across from mine. When it was my turn to speak, I told the police the full story, trying to explain that Janet's actions had been provoked. It felt like the least I could do. They released me with an apology at 11 p.m. On Monday, I went to work as usual, grateful for the peace that being underground provided, where cell signals couldn't reach me. On the way home, I updated Alice over the phone. She invited me over for dinner and relayed a sweet request from Diana. "Can that nice Kurt read me a bedtime story tonight?" Running later than usual, I stopped by Wendy's parents' house. I explained what I knew about Wendy's manipulation of Janet. Surprisingly, her parents weren't shocked. I urged them to persuade Wendy not to press charges against Janet, and they promised to help. When I arrived home, I saw Janet's car in the garage. Upstairs, her suitcases were unpacked, and I could hear the shower running. Anticipating what was coming, I waited downstairs and called Alice to cancel our dinner plans. We speculated about Janet's intentions, but neither of us saw what was coming next. Janet strode down the stairs confidently, a wave of unease hitting me. "What's for dinner, Kurt?" I hesitated before answering, and she stepped directly in front of me. "I've decided to forgive you, Kurt," she announced. "We've both been foolish, but let's move on. I'm back. If you haven't made dinner plans, let's go out." I struggled to find words, my disbelief evident. "Forgive me. Janet, what exactly have I done that I need forgiving for?" For the first time, Janet's confidence wavered. "For the pain you caused with that ridiculous divorce stunt, Kurt. It was a low blow, but I knew you were bluffing." "What makes you so sure I was bluffing, Janet?" "Because Wendy said—" Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. She sank onto the coffee table, the color draining from her face. For several long minutes, I watched as a new understanding took hold. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I gave you up, didn't I? You weren't bluffing about the divorce. I thought you were, so I signed it. I shook my head sadly. For the record, Janet, you didn't give me up, you threw me away. I've always done everything I could for you. And what did I get in return? You left me alone, lost and confused. I warned you it was a gamble. After all the love and effort I put in, I expected at least respect and loyalty. But did I get that? No, I got disrespected and abandoned. Did you ever think about the imbalance in our marriage? The one-sided effort I've seen over the last 5 weeks? No, Janet whispered. You let someone manipulate you into thinking you could get more. Well, Wendy's out of the picture now, she added. This isn't about Wendy. I know she tried to drive us apart, but I never considered her more than a manipulator, I replied. So we're okay now, right, Kurt? Janet asked, hope in her voice. This was the moment of truth. No, Janet, we're not okay. The divorce papers prove it. I can't forget the disrespect, the threats. And when you threw me away, someone else picked me up. Janet stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. For the first time in all these weeks, the realization seemed to sink in. Her gamble had cost her everything. You can't mean that, Kurt, she whispered, shaking her head slowly. You're just saying this to hurt me. You wouldn't... I don't want to hurt you, Janet, I interrupted softly. I never wanted any of this. But I've come to understand that you and we've been living in two different worlds. I stayed, waiting, hoping things would go back to the way they were. But you pushed me away time and time again. She sat down, her hands trembling as she placed them in her lap. But I signed those papers because I thought you were bluffing. I thought you were testing me, just like I was testing you. I sighed, the weight of all the emotions I had been carrying finally feeling lighter. This was never a test, Janet. Not for me. I wanted to fix things, to understand why you felt the way you did. But instead, you gave up on us, on everything we built. She lowered her head, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with years ago, the woman who had once been my partner, my friend, my confidant. But that person was buried now, hidden beneath layers of pride, manipulation, and regret. I never stopped loving you, Kurt, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Even now, I still love you. I closed my eyes briefly, struggling to keep my composure. Love isn't enough, Janet. Not anymore. Love without respect, without trust. It's hollow. You've made me feel like I was the only one fighting for this marriage, and I've come to realize that's not the kind of relationship I want. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw true vulnerability in her. I didn't think it would end like this, she whispered. I thought I could push you, that you would fight harder for me, for us. I never expected you to let go. I knelt down in front of her, my heart heavy but resolute. I didn't let go, Janet. You pushed me away. I stayed as long as I could, but eventually, I had to start thinking about myself, about what I need and deserve in a relationship. And I deserve more than what you've given me these past few months. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her breath shaky. Is she the reason? The woman you met? I hesitated, then nodded. She's not the reason our marriage ended, Janet. That was between you and me. But she helped me see that I was worth more than being someone's second choice. She helped me realize that I deserve someone who respects me, who doesn't treat love like a game. Janet stood abruptly, her face hardening as she tried to suppress her emotions. So that's it then? You're just going to walk away? After everything we've been through, all the plans we made, you'll just throw it all away for some woman you barely know? I shook my head, feeling a pang of sorrow for how far we had drifted from each other. I'm not throwing anything away, Janet. I'm moving forward. And honestly, I think you need to do the same. This version of us, it isn't healthy. It's been toxic for both of us. She paced around the room, running her hands through her hair in frustration. I thought we had more time, she muttered. I thought we could figure it out. We had plenty of time, Janet, but you chose to test me instead of talking to me. You chose to push me away instead of pulling me closer. And now it's too late. The words seemed to hang in the air, final and irreversible. Janet stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't mean for it to end like this, she said, her voice small. I never wanted to lose you. I stood, feeling the need to bring this conversation to a close. Maybe one day you'll understand why it ended this way. But for now, we need to accept that it's over. We've hurt each other too much to go back. She looked at me one last time, her eyes searching mine for something, perhaps a sign that there was still hope. But there was none. Not anymore. As I turned to leave, Janet called out to me, her voice trembling. "What happens now, Kurt? What do I do?" I paused at the door, my hand resting on the knob. "You figure out who you are without me," I said quietly, "and I'll do the same." With that, I walked out, closing the door softly behind me. Outside, the evening air was cool against my skin, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. The chaos that had consumed my life for so long was finally over, and while the future was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was free. As I got into my car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Alice. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Diana can't wait to hear her bedtime story." A small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. I texted back a quick reply and started the engine, heading towards something new, something real, something built on mutual respect and understanding. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Whatever the future held, I was ready for it.